Valve sent a shockwave through the gaming industry with the announcement of the Steam Deck, its portable hybrid console, promising uncompromised PC gaming on the go, with access to the entirety of a user's Steam library in the palm of their hand. Instantly, comparisons were made to another similar piece of hardware, the Nintendo Switch, seeing the Steam Deck as an answer to the explosive popularity of Nintendo's latest console. However, the similarities between these two devices are really only skin deep. The Switch is a low-cost, low-powered device meant to spend just as much time in the living room as it is in your bag, a way of bringing the company's decades of handheld dominance home to roost in your entertainment center. A simple, obvious goal on the part of Nintendo. The true purpose of the Steam Deck is a bit more obscure, and goes to the heart of Valve's entire business model, and how that model is currently under threat. Valve has always been first and foremost a PC gaming company. While they've tried their hand at hardware a few times in the past, as well as brought some of their most successful titles to consoles, Valve's bread and butter is the personal computer, both in the games they develop themselves, as well as their seemingly indomitable golden goose, Steam. While it may be all but synonymous with PC gaming today, Steam started out far more humble. Initially released in 2003, it was merely a launcher for all of Valve's games, a simple way to automatically keep their titles all updated and patched across their entire player base, as well as strengthening anti-piracy and anti-cheat measures. If you wanted to play Half-Life or popular mods like Counter-Strike and Day of Defeat, you'd access them through Steam. This was just the beginning though, with Valve planning on opening Steam up to more developers. At the time, most PC games were still sold at brick-and-mortar retailers on disc, and Steam allowed a much higher revenue share per copy as opposed to physical sales. By 2007, major players like Capcom, id Software, and Eidos had begun publishing through Steam, and eventually it became the gaming juggernaut we know today. The benefits for Valve with the industry adoption of Steam went beyond easy patching though. Being the platform owner, Valve got a cut of every game sale that occurred on Steam, making the company boatloads of cash, far more than they ever could just making games themselves. It was a slam dunk business model for the company. There was just one small problem. The PC gaming market is, obviously, played on PCs, and those PCs are virtually all running Windows, a platform that both Steam and all the titles it hosted depends on. And Windows is owned by Microsoft, a company that not only A, isn't Steam, but B, is itself heavily invested in the gaming market as well, with both the Xbox brand as well as developing a lot of the core graphical APIs that these PC games leverage. While hard to see it coming back in 1998 when Valve first launched the original Half-Life, the Microsoft of today is very much a gaming company. And as the years went on and that segment of Microsoft's business continued to expand, it became more clear that the company wasn't happy that the gaming market on PC was built entirely on the back of their platform and their technology, but they saw almost none of the returns for it. Valve had built their entire business on a foundation that now wanted to tear them down. And in 2017, Microsoft fired a shot across Valve's bow with the release of Game Pass. Microsoft must have realized that merely building their own clone of Steam would never work to unseat Valve, considering other platforms like Epic and GOG had tried before and failed to build much traction. So instead, they decided to disrupt the PC gaming sales method in a similar way to Valve had with Steam itself 14 years prior. By giving users a Netflix-style subscription access to all the games they wanted for a small monthly fee, for the first time in decades, Microsoft had found a way to effectively begin chipping away at Valve's dominance on their platform, giving PC gamers a reason to play on something other than Steam. Every title that was played on Game Pass's subscription was a potential lost sale of that same game over on Steam, and Netflix and Spotify had both proven how successful the a la carte model of media consumption works in comparison to individual purchases. Valve had to find a way to decouple their platform from an operating system made by a company actively trying to destroy them, or risk losing the gaming market to access models, similar to what happened to Apple with iTunes and Spotify. So Valve turned to Linux. Linux is a free open-source alternative operating system to Windows. Unlike Windows, which only has one singular release active at a time, Linux is far more like an ecosystem in some ways than strictly just an OS. Anyone in the community can build their own spin or distro of Linux with its own desktop environment, package manager, and basically everything else. They're all based on the same underlying Linux kernel though, which makes all these different versions of Linux mostly work together with each other and why they're still technically all the same OS. The most important aspect to Valve was that, as an open source project, Linux isn't owned by Microsoft, and therefore, if they could build up Linux as a legitimate alternative to Windows for gaming, they could wrestle gaming away from Microsoft and by extension from Game Pass. The problem is DirectX. This API, made by Microsoft, is the backbone of nearly the entire PC gaming ecosystem. And not only is it controlled by the very company threatening Valve, DirectX isn't even available on Linux, meaning nearly every PC game ever released only works on Windows, and Windows alone. Valve has been attacking this issue in a few different ways for a few years now. Most notably, they've been developing Proton, software that allows Windows games to run on Linux. It isn't a blanket solution, there are still lots of gaps, but they're actively being plugged from efforts by both Valve and the Linux community, which has already spearheaded similar work with community projects such as wean, an open source Windows compatibility layer that has been in development for decades, and is what Valve used as a basis for Proton. Of course, game compatibility is only half the problem. Even if Valve could snap their fingers and have every game on Steam magically work with Proton, that doesn't really matter if all the players are still using Windows. And why wouldn't they be? Linux is mostly an OS used by developers and hardcore tech nerds. It has virtually zero consumer presence, it's next to impossible to buy a PC pre-installed with Linux, and manually installing it onto a system someone already owns is above the pay grade of the average user, and even if it wasn't, what reason would anyone have to install it in the first place? Proton at its best meets Windows where it currently is. It doesn't provide anything new. And that's exactly what Valve needed to do to make this whole scheme work. Something new. Something that would make PC gamers want to adopt Linux, even if they didn't realize they were doing it. Something that could let them game in a way their desktops and laptops couldn't, Windows or otherwise. Hence, the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck, despite being able to run the bulk of your existing Steam library, isn't doing so on the back of a Windows install. Valve is instead shipping each Steam Deck running its own version of Linux, called Steamos. By creating a new piece of hardware and promising a whole new way to play your games in addition to your home gaming PC, Valve gets a Linux install into homes that would otherwise have just kept using Windows. Any game not yet working either natively on Linux or via Proton becomes an exception that sticks out in the eyes of gamers that only a few months ago couldn't care less if their games played on Linux or not. So this incentivizes developers to invest more in Linux compatibility for their titles, because working on Linux means working on the Steam Deck. The more this compatibility is adopted, the less of a vice grip Microsoft has on the market due to DirectX, and the closer Valve becomes to no longer needing Windows at all. Being open source, if the Steam Deck does well, and pre-orders seem to show that that's likely, there's nothing stopping Valve from releasing SteamOS to the technically savvy who may want to run the OS on something beyond a Steam Deck, or partner with vendors selling gaming PCs and have new systems ship with SteamOS instead of Windows, or at least offer the choice. It's still too early to tell how Valve's Trojan horse gambit will pay off, but it'll be interesting to see how such a bold move will affect the PC gaming space going into 2022. And if you want to watch something else interesting, we have a whole video about why the Mac doesn't have any games that dives a bit deeper into the whole DirectX API deal. So if you feel like getting a bit more geeky, check that one out next.